Hi there. So we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Joe Charap, and I'm the Director of Horticulture at the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm also the Vice Chair of the Historic Landscapes Committee. I'm thrilled today to be joined by my friend and mentor, Dr. Frank Rossi from Cornell University. But before I get into that, I want to make a little bit of a background on today and the collaboration between Greenwood and Cornell. In 2015, after noticing the effects of climate change, specifically the spread of invasive grasses, Bermuda grass in particular at Greenwood, and the degradation of the landscape as a result of a mechanical mowing model, I started a pretty relentless harassment campaign to convince Dr. Rossi to come visit us at Greenwood. Dr. Rossi specializes in the ecological aspect of turf grass management. And what we were hoping to solve were two issues. One was the spread of Bermuda grass on site, and the other was a way to manage our 478 acres, much of which is turf grass, in a more ecologically sound way. We started a 3-year partnership in 2017, the goal of which was to create a data-driven management model to inform the way we managed our landscape, and to use that as a model and a learning hub to advocate for the management of urban grasslands beyond Greenwood, be they public parks, arboreta, botanic gardens, and to create a model that could be applied there as well. So without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Frank Rossi, Professor of Horticulture at Cornell University. Frank.
Thank you, Joe. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. One of the few times I'm taking my mask off a little bit. Thought I'd just say hi to everybody through my mask. Everyone knows what we're going through. We'll do a little bit to distract you here, and I think we've got a really interesting story to tell from the management of these grasslands for the world that lies ahead of us as it begins to over the next several years return to some sense of normalcy. So let me talk to you about how great it is to chat with Joe about this. Sorry, interruption?
Sorry, Frank, it's me. I just wanted to say that if folks do have questions, Frank will have a few breaks in his presentation, and I'll be able to moderate and ask those questions once you submit them to the Q&A forum in the Zoom meeting.
Perfect. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I don't pay attention to those things, so it's good that somebody's tracking them. It allows me to pay attention to staring at my computer screen, unfortunately, instead of staring at you. So the topic for the next little bit will be managing these historic urban grasslands that I've had the privilege of working with Joe on over these last several years. And as a New York City kid myself, I never even knew this place existed until Joe contacted me and I wandered out there. I was from the mainland in the Bronx, not from Brooklyn, which is on one of the many island boroughs we have in New York. And of course, a national historic landmark as well. Oh, sorry. Let me get this right. There we go. Okay, so let's start with the first part of our presentation today, which is what characterizes a historic urban grassland. And I want to say up front, even though we're going to talk about historic urban grasslands, it begins with this framework. You know, the idea that lawns and landscapes and sports fields and golf courses, have this enormous aesthetic draw to us and how we've been driven to it. Many would argue from a cosmetic perspective. What gets lost in it is all the other services that these grasslands provides, even if we begin to notice them, right? I mean, if we begin to notice them, a lot of times we notice them, oh, why are there weeds there? Oh, why isn't the grass cut? And we don't think, and so therefore we think sometimes, well, let's just get rid of these things. What do we need lawns for? We need golf course. What do we need these historic grasslands where there's people that we call urban grasslands, right? That are right up near where people are. I mean, what's the purpose of them? Well, historically, they've been aesthetically pleasing. You mow them. But now we're starting to understand the broader role that these land uses fulfill and service us for, especially in heavily built environments. And we're seeing that sort of uniqueness of these heavily built environments and the clusters of people in urban environments. That the haven that green spaces provide is a clear indication of what I think the future lies ahead for a lot of these urban grasslands, is these recreational, these cultural and inspirational benefits we get beyond just the way it looks. And I think we can broaden that discussion in our framework today. So just wanted to start out by saying, really, everything I'm talking about is in this context. All right. Well, Greenwood is just opened my eyes to the glorious number of historic grasslands we have throughout the United States and really throughout the world. Places, parts of the world we're trying to preserve, present some enormous challenges as we talk about climate change. But what Greenwood in particular, and a little bit that I've learned from Mike Stakowitz at the National Park Service, who was provided great information and as the turf specialist for the Park Service and his role there, has been really useful in getting resources out to, turf managers who don't normally think about these sorts of things. So where does this begin? Well, it sort of begins with, what do you got? What are you trying to preserve? How do you assess what you have? And then you say, okay, well, it's not what I want. I got to rehab it. I got to restore it. Okay, I want to take it back to the way it was. Or I got to reconstruct it. I got to build it for ADA, or I got to build it for social distancing guidelines that my area wasn't set up for. All of a sudden the walk's got to be, 15 feet wide instead of 8 feet wide, whatever those standards are. So, I think this is something realistic that all of us are going to confront, whether it's historic or otherwise. And then, when you think about those things, if you're going to redo something, how do you build resiliency into that system? It's got to look old, but function in a resilient and sustainable way. And so a lot of my work with Joe at Greenwood and work we've been doing there and starting this urban grassland work there is to really focus on, okay, what do we got and how are we going to manage what we got? We're tweaking around the rehab, restoration, reconstruction as it comes, right? But a lot of our work is in the top and the bottom, because really Greenwood needs a data-driven approach. They can't sit around waiting for me to decide, well, how do we, redo 400 acres in the flip of an eye? We've got to transition ourselves to this way we want to be in the future. And as the climate's changing, it certainly is going to reward the more nimble, flexible, data-driven operations. I think moving forward, there's a case to be made for that. So when you're looking at preservation, what are you trying to preserve? How would you characterize your grassland now? Joe looked around and said, I got Bermuda grass everywhere. So this looks bad. Art Presson, who also works with us, shows me pictures of cemeteries in Connecticut, historic cemetery, all zoysia grass, 100%. Brown until, late May, early June, if you're lucky, depends on where you are. So obviously that's sort of noticing it. How would you characterize that? Some people say that's completely degraded. So what measures are you going to do? We're going to nuke the place. We're going to spray chemicals everywhere. Well, we can try that. And some of that was tried at Greenwood. And it seemed to be a bit futile without even more aggressive, more vigilant approaches. So, what is sustainable? Yeah, you can do these things, but can we sustain it in its form and integrity, right? So we have to ask ourselves these questions as we embark upon this. Well, at Greenwood, I was lucky to show up right after Superstorm Sandy, which allowed, among the many tree things that they worry about at Greenwood, and Joe and I talk about this all the time. Obviously, this was identified as a big part of this cultural landscape report. And of course, if you're in the, historic grassland business or historic landscape business, you have to believe these cultural landscape reports are banging around somewhere. I never even knew they existed until I bumped into them at Greenwood. So, this is a place to start. So what's really interesting is when you look at the cultural landscape report, and then you look at what some of the major thinkers were talking about at the time that this was happening, you start to see this was some quotes from Frank J. Scott. These were not in the cultural landscape reports, but much of the cemetery has shaded walks. This is from the, I'm sorry, I'm mistaken. This is from the cultural landscape report. In the report, there's a couple of mentions of lawns. And in those quotes, it says the lawns are spotted with specimen trees and shrubs creating this sylvan lifestyle. And you can see a picture of the sylvan still life there to the left. And then another quote that says these are creating within the open lawn areas a characteristic landscape of plantings and objects. Now, I don't know what your historic landscape is like, but in that cultural landscape report, they did a nice job of looking at trees and characters and, of course, monuments and historic features that were in there. But really, not much attention was paid in the cultural landscape report to the role of the grassland. While many things were inventoried, there wasn't really a lot that was characterizing the species of plants were there. It mentioned a number of problems along slopes and things like that. But obviously, you're going to begin with any sort of work in historic grasslands with what's the roadmap? Well, we didn't have a big roadmap for the grasslands from this cultural landscape report. And it's not uncommon that the grasslands themselves, beyond what looked like some minor issues of slopes and topographical things and eroding features, there really wasn't much mention at all about the grasslands. So I went back in the literature, literally in preparation for this talk, but also I had done it, cursory in advance, but sometimes teaching something is the best way of learning it yourself. I bumped into a number of landscape architects. Frank J. Scott was one, did this Victorian Gardens book, The Art of Beautifying Suburban Home Grounds. And in it, he writes that places that are so cluttered with flowers, trees, and shrubs that it becomes vexatious, right? Means annoying for a good mower to get in among them. Now, in mower, he means a person. He means a person. And they're certainly not well planted. So he says, okay, why would you plant something you had a difficult time getting around? And then he says, make sure you leave enough breadth to swing a scythe, because wherever there's any lawn, it's not useful to use these little hand mowing machines. Now he's talking about the push mechanical mowers, right? The real mowers that Edward Budding invented. And he said, if you're going to have to use these machines and you can't swing a scythe, the lawn is not worth maintaining. Well, let me tell you something. Do we have that at Greenwood, in addition to a number of other things? So first off, what were we telling people to plant back then, right? What was common in the literature, in historic landscape literature, if you're thinking about preserving and restoring? So I go to Wiedemann, was the superintendent of city parks and also of the Cedar Hill Cemetery in Hartford, Connecticut. He published a little book called Beautifying Country Homes. And in it, he goes through his mixtures that he would have planted. Now in here, it's very interesting. I have to say, let me take a minute for all of you plant people. I have particular fondness to this spring ephemeral, this sweet scented vernal grass, Anthoxantha moderatum. I did some of my research with that at the University of Rhode Island in the mid 80s. It's a widely adapted grass. It grows, they have these 175-year-old fertilizer plots outside of London where they've tried, 15 different pHs and 20 different nutrient programs that they've maintained for 170 years. And the only grass that grows in every single one of them is sweet vernal grass. So in temperate climates where you can grow C3 grasses effectively, that's going to be, you'll still see this along roadsides today. Meadow foxtail very much, meadow foxtail, much like many of the traditional foxtails we see. Red top is an agrostis species. So it's a bentgrass. It's essentially a bentgrass. Then you've got these fescues. These are the fine leaf fescues, what we call the fine leaf fescues. Annual ryegrass, what they called perennial ryegrass. It might have been rye that they had in the field. And now you start to see what they had in the pastures, right? This is what's coming out of the pastures that made its way into what they were calling the early lawn grasses, and certainly worthy of paying attention to. Right now, you look a little more closely at these mixes. It's really fascinating. Crested dogtail is Cynosurus species. In fact, it was a grass that was used for bonnets. The flowers would be used for bonnets. There's a rough stalk meadow grass, which I believe is Poa trivialis, but then there's just straight up meadow grass, meadow fescue, or might even be meadow foxtail, where it's a different kind of Poa species, Poa nemoralis. I've not heard of that very often. June grass is a Calaria, grows in very sandy soils. But what's really interesting that Wiedemann did, and it's really, if you're a plant person, it's absolutely fascinating. But what's really interesting is what he did is he said, okay, the previous page, let's go back here for a second. The previous page is, you know, sort of the stuff we see in things we call lawns. You know, you're going to plant a lawn, put all this different stuff in there because we don't know how to really manage things other than cutting it. We don't fertilize grass. We don't really do anything but cut it. So here's what seems to grow. And you could say, boy, this is the early days of what we know as the eco lawn today. And then he said, well, if you frequently mow it, right? Check this out. If you frequently mow it, he includes a few different plants. But if you want a lawn pasture, it looks a little bit more like the previous page. There clearly are plants that don't like frequent mowing and plants that will tolerate frequent mowing. And one of the things you see come out of this a lot are some of the things you find in pastures, or like the vernal grass comes out because it doesn't tolerate frequent mowing. Orchard grass comes out because it doesn't tolerate frequent mowing. So just a very interesting look at, would we even plant these things today? And how much of this do we see in our landscape? And I'll tell you, as we've done our work at Greenwood, where we've mowed less, we've seen volunteer plants come in that we never would have imagined have been there. Now, as you get into Bailey and the early 1900s, I'm not going to drive us crazy with this, but things like crested dogtail, bent grass, wood meadow grass is that Poa nemoralis that I was talking about. And Bailey's talking a little bit about differentiating more site-specific, sandy soils, shaded places. And you can also see the number of grasses and plants that are in there, including the lack of clover anymore, are found in here. So you see, you know, the evolution as we turn into the 20th century. All right. So here's my sense of this, and I can answer some questions here if any of you have them before we move on. But essentially, if you're interested in really, hey, how do I get this back to what it was? These were plants that they were planted to grasses and forbs that they just found and that were used for purposes that didn't include aesthetically pleasing, frequently mechanically mowed landscapes. So again, you know, we need these historic landscapes in some ways to, you know, function in a modern world. And now it's I think about it even differently because not a lot of these grasses are going to have the kind of traffic tolerance or mowing tolerance that we ask of our modern urban grassland. So let me stop there for a second, Joe. I'll take a little beverage and we'll see if there's any questions right now.
We don't have any questions yet in the Q&A, but
do you have any questions?
Me, no. I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we can press on. That gives me just a chance to take a breath, get a drink, and we can move on. I do see one in the question and answer head. Oh, did or didn't? Okay, that's not right. I'll go back to sharing. We'll go back to the talk. Okay, Joe?
Sounds good.
All right. All right, so here we are. We really don't have grasses that are set up for this. And it turns out we don't have landscapes sometimes set up for it. Now, the interesting thing about a picture like this at Greenwood is the obvious, boy, that's got to be a hard slope to mow. And it is, but it's south facing, which means while we have soil insects and grubs all over the landscape throughout Greenwood, the only place we really see problems, number one, is where the animals dig it up. And if the animals don't dig it up, the only other place we see problems are on severely south-facing slopes, right, where it dries, right, where the pruning of the root system that the soil insects do, right, creates this kind of aesthetic. Now, gosh, there's 15,000 ways you might approach dealing with this, including not having grass there at all, and I'm for that. I mean, if we're really thinking about preserving these landscapes and we look at how they're functioning in the modern world and we know the kind of time and it takes and the lack of sort of beauty that it creates, and now we got soil erosion problems. So again, functioning in the modern landscapes, not so straightforward, right? Reestablishing. Right. I mean, we've done this 3 or 4 times in the same area at Greenwood. And you can even see really interestingly here, a good example, you know, we go to the trouble to do a little bit of vegetation control. We scalp it down, we clean it up, and then we seed into this, and we still see the Bermuda grass and weeds are present. So a lot of the practices that many years ago used to work and not have problems because we didn't have prolific Bermuda grass issues would have worked. But a lot of those practices haven't adapted over the years to the things we face now. And so working with Greenwood, we've had to reimagine the way when they disturb the soil and are going to replant, that it has to be done in a much more systematized, site-specific, data-driven way. Because this is life at historic landscapes. I mean, no matter whether you're digging a grave or mowing, these things are happening in these landscapes. Because you're fixing paths, and again, with COVID adaptations, you may be making things wider and creating different space. And I wouldn't presume to know, but if you're in an urban area and you've got a lot of grass, I don't find too many that don't experience some sort of disruption without great care. And I would say, to a certain extent, this is going to get more intense as now we've found these places to be these enormous havens for our urban populations. Now, again, in Greenwood, this is one of the facts of life in managing the landscape, is the monuments, which are historic monuments of their own in many ways, now experience this sort of, this sort of damage on a pretty regular basis. So I think I made the case to a certain extent that obviously there's a lot of challenges that face being an urban grassland, period, and then being historic. So Joe, is there a question?
We've got a hand raised.
You want to give him a mic?
Sure. Do that. The question is, when you say the modern lawn practices haven't adapted, what explicitly do you mean? Adapted to what? For what?
Where did I say that? Here?
Yeah.
Modern lawn practices haven't adapted. Yes, modern lawn practices are mowing every week, mowing either nowhere near the 1/3 rule, not paying attention and looking at strategic ways to allow certain areas to thrive under less frequent mowing. We modern mowing is getting for efficiency, is getting bigger and bulkier for productivity purposes. A lot of what I refer to when I'm talking about this, and Joe will know what I mean, is this production mentality. And I'm not calling out any companies here or anything, but the production mentality that I got to get through this landscape quickly, right? Because I can only make so much money. And cemeteries themselves present enormous challenges for profitability as they try to outsource these things, and could be the same for all public gardens. And I think what we've noticed, and what I think I was referring to, is we need a more progressive approach that's flexible, that says I can get a mower to mow at 5 inches. Right. And so I can process areas that I can let go higher because they're not frequently visited and there's no risk to having them like that. I'm just mowing them once in a while and I'm increasing diversity out there. And that's, I think, what I was referring to, Joe, at the time. Does that make sense now?
Yeah. One more question before
Let's hear it.
From Rowan. You highlighted Anthoxanthum odoratum.
Yeah.
How many other grasses on that historic list were non-native?
Oh, I don't care.
You didn't expect that question from?
No, and I don't really, I'd have to look more closely at it. I would imagine most of them were not native. The bent grasses could have been native. The fescues could have been native. But I don't know what native means, because none of the northeastern United States had very many grasses at all on it, because unless they were pastures, because we're a climax forest. So I don't know what I usually avoid caring about those things because they confound function sometimes. But I will say most of them probably came over in the ballast of ships and that were used in agriculture and were receiving some form of management, be they from manure or defoliation from feeding animals or scythes for hay. I can't really say, and I haven't really researched whether they're quote unquote native or not. They certainly would all be considered by now naturalized over the last couple of 100 years.
Okay, that is it for now.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, Joe. I mean, we could have this conversation, and I'm sure I'm speaking to people that are not used to talking to a turfgrass person, or I'm not used to talking to people, you know, sometimes that don't sort of, the way we do turf, there's nothing native. Let's just be clear about this. There's none of the plants that we use in modern turfgrass management of any kind are, as we describe turf, are native. None of them. Even if they were, they don't resemble anything from what they were originally developed for, because turf really is a function of the modern built environment. There's nothing more anthropogenic as a plant than turf grass, because as we go through this COVID thing, you know, if you don't mow it, it's not really what its function is. I'm not sure what that thing is for then. And so we no longer have plants that work in a completely human created thing that you find native. We don't see a lot of, there's been some work at the I'm sorry, not Betty Ford, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Foundation. There's some scientists down there. I think one of his names is Simmons. He's one of the only guys I've ever seen, one of the only groups I've ever seen, look at the use of native grasses. And they were looking at a lot of southern warm season plants down there for use in modern systems. And one of the things that a lot of these native plants lack is traffic tolerance and the ability to tolerate frequent mowing. So that's a really fascinating question. Thank you for asking that question. Let me get back to this and say that the next part of my presentation, we'll talk a little bit about climate. Now, I could make the whole conversation about climate, but let's just start with what the problems are. Well, for us in the United States, and particularly for us in the northeastern United States or the north central United States, are a real increase in expected extreme precipitation events. And a lot of us know what that means, in the sense that, you know, when the rainfall amounts are increasing or not changing, but the number of events are changing, you're getting less frequent, more intense events. Dealing with that water in one event creates enormous challenges, especially as we've seen over the last couple of years, where the soil's already wet and then another 2 inches of rainfall comes down. So having landscapes that don't wash out, or having these urban knobs and knolls, and like the moraines that we have, the moraine landscape we have at Greenwood, this creates enormous challenges and already cost Greenwood real dollars to have to fix. Now, you know, if, emergency funds or not, you know, this is parts of the landscape that are only going to be more impacted by the things that the climate is creating for us. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say the damage that these storms are doing to the tree canopy. Now, no, everyone who knows me knows I'm not a tree lover. You know, I glory in trees. I have respect for them, but I live in a world where if you want to put people on grass and grow, you know, really healthy stands of grass that you can do things on and, you know, manage, you know, use intensely, you can't have a lot of trees in those spaces. But you don't have urban grasslands if you don't have grasses and trees. And so you know, one of the things Joe and I talk about a lot is, because the storms have changed the canopy cover we have at Greenwood, right? And that's allowing the warm season grasses, which are generally intolerant to shade, especially Bermuda grass, especially if you mow it, it won't tolerate it at all. You know, the plan has to be to increase tree plantings. That's going to give the existing vegetation a competitive advantage, or historic vegetation a more competitive advantage. It's a very interesting component of looking at it from a climate change. You know, we can go through this, but here's the period of time. You know, Greenwood started you know, somewhere over here, right? 1820, right? And you see this long period of time where not much happens. And then right around here, you see an inflection point in this particular way of looking at the data set, right? Where we started to see the slope of the line now that we're all becoming curve experts, right? Right. You see a relatively flat curve, and then industrialization builds up. We see a little bit more. And then you see, once we start burning fossil fuels as a way of life, you see the enormous and dramatic increase in that. And there seems to be an inflection point in the 60s. Now, what's really fascinating, I don't even know if Joe's seen this completely. I've been working with this modeler through a collaborator on our project at Greenwood at Measure.io. We've instrumented the landscape to look at microclimate effects. And right now, some of the data mining we've been doing is indicating in the literature, it says Bermuda grass behaves a particular way around temperature, and it's somewhat average temperature, and there's this lethal chilling temperature that will cause the death of Bermuda grass. And it looks like right in about 1965, that critical level changed. And it's pretty much been since 1965 that the environmental conditions have been conducive to Bermuda grass survival and growth. Now, I want to look at vigor in the last 2 decades, but we haven't gotten into the modeling of that yet. But as a scientist and working with historic grasslands, I'd encourage you to, find a land grant scientist to work with. You're in different states. I don't know where everybody is, but there are a lot of people looking, do what I do, who this has been a great application of a lot of research and thinking that's just sitting on the shelf that no one ever asked for because, we had a lot of resources and a lot of money, and the climate wasn't changing as rapidly. And obviously that's changed dramatically. So here's an example of the gridded map we're developing with these bulbs. These are simple monitoring of a variety of weather conditions. We've placed them strategically throughout the cemetery at Greenwood. And we have, very clear demarcations of microclimates that become part of our decision-making when it comes to managing these landscapes, right? So you can see these things, and we're still working through the criteria. Now, this isn't very commonly done, but we use it as a way of monitoring the growth rates. And we're ground truing these microclimate things with plant growth and grassland growth and the need for mowing. A lot of this stuff is used for driving our mowing needs. And of course, because all this is happening, this is what the warm season grasses are resulting in the landscape at Greenwood. This is a picture of a zoysia grass invasion, much more common throughout northern climates to see zoysia grass invasion. But a lot of the things that we're struggling with at Greenwood are Bermuda grass invasion, which becomes the same. It just completely crowds out all the other plants that are there. Now, in the future, in the next 20 to 30 years, I would suspect it might be a hybrid grassland of enough cool season grass so that it's green at Mother's Day, but enough warm season grass that it persists during the summer without a lot of additional maintenance. So again, let's get back to, I tried to set the context, right? Historic grasslands, climate change. Here's the challenges. I'm sprinkling some of the things in there. How do we deal with this? Again, how do we maximize these services? Listen, no one's going to be comfortable just saying, I have to cut this grass because it's got to be cut every 7 days, or it has to look like center field at Yankee Stadium. You might have certain places where that's a high demand, but I want to challenge each of us to wonder how do we characterize our urban grasslands? And there's, this particular research publication by my colleague, Jenny Gow-Niffen, and her graduate student at the time, now a professor at the Iowa State University, Grant Thompson, have really elaborated on this topic in this particular paper. All right, so how do we build climate resiliency in historic urban grasslands? And this is the rest of it. So I spent a half an hour setting it up, and now hopefully I'm going to give you a half an hour of kind of stuff you can do, and we can have questions there. So obviously, no surprise, starts with the soil. Second, it's if you have an urban grassland and you got people using it, you either have to restrict the way they use it, or you have to up the way you manage the turf if you want it to be able to withstand that traffic. Now, I'm telling you, if I gave this talk last year or 3 months ago, I would have talked to you totally different than I'm talking to you now about the world I think we all know we live in, with urban grasslands getting the kinds of pressure that they're under for people wanting a haven when they simply can't, do the things they're normally doing. And again, if that gets traction with people, boy, I really liked walking in the park. I really like that place I went to. I really like that. Boy, I want to keep doing that. It made me feel good. If we get a 15, 20% increase in people that want to do that in the New York metropolitan area, we're not going to have enough grass to put people on. So we're going to have to be thoughtful about that. Then I want to talk a little bit about maybe the grasses you try for these things from the perspective that I'm familiar with. We're looking at that. And then as we think about managing the landscape more intentionally, how can we allow it to be more pollinator friendly? Why does a lawn have to be devoid of flowers? I've heard people who study, I interact with entomologists and natural resource people here that are constantly saying lawns can be these havens for some spring ephemerals, times when nothing else is growing that we've historically classified as weeds are flowering really early and bringing in interesting pollinators into that system. And so that's the kinds of ways we need to look at these grasslands. And again, I don't presume to know about native or non-native, but what I want to know is, here's how I need this grassland to service the world I want to live in. And that includes helping the bees and the birds. And it also means not emitting as much carbon and other things from fertilizers and mowing, and that's where mowing responsibly comes in. So let's spend the rest of the time going through these things. All right. Ooh, okay. Well, you hear, and of course at Cornell University, we love the whole idea of soil health, right? This is a phraseology that we termed a number of years ago to characterize multiple parts of a soil test that account for chemical, physical, and biological properties, not simply a nutrient test, or not simply a physical test, or not here's the microbes in there. But if the microbes are in there, what are they doing? Are they are they helping with nutrient cycling? A lot of soil health work, and what you hear people talk about soil health as we know it, is all based around production agriculture and agronomic practices. It's not based around urban grasslands, lawns, sports fields. We haven't done it yet. We have some general ideas about these indices, but generally you can grow grass. If your soil will grow grass, it will sustain itself just from laying down organic matter. When you look at these really old profiles that we're digging at Greenwood, right? You see this horizon up here where the organic matter is, about, 10 inches thick, 10 inches thick, a foot thick of organic matter. And then you've got this other layer where organic acids are leaking down, and then you get more subsoil. And so grasses build soils. So we can talk about soil health, but the place to start is, let's get some vegetation on that soil. Close cut vegetation that we manage in a way, because we can store a lot of carbon here. And one of the things I want you to consider as we think about mowing differently and planting different plants in there for pollinator friendliness differently is this carbon storage maxes out. As grasslands age, the amount of carbon they can store in here gets maxed out, and you're simply not able to continue to store it, and you sort of become a net loser in some ways if you keep fertilizing and emitting, mowing it. So one of the things we've been talking about more is introducing plants at the top that now start rooting down into these deeper profiles. And that's where more native plants, blue stems, could come in, right? Not native to here, but native grassland plants that, if we're going to manage them more like grasslands with the occasional mowing, maybe some maritime and northeastern, coastal grasses, or different kinds of native prairie grasses that, Neil DeBole might try to sell me from Prairie Nursery in Wisconsin, will be able to root deeper into the soil profile. And understanding your soil is the first step there. Now, as I said, right, what is urban grassland soil health? Well, urban, any kind of soil health is really defined as the ability of the soil to function. Well, what's its function? Well, in corn, it's to produce corn, right? In a grassland, I might want a grassland soil that doesn't really promote a lot of growth. or can restore itself to good health after we dig a hole, right? I mean, if we're going to disturb it, it's hard to know what good soil health is when you're always mucking with it. So this is a big research area that lies ahead, I think, for all of us in understanding this better. But let's just talk about the way grassland soils work, because by understanding this, you can understand the best way to manage moving forward. And it begins with, what do grasses do, right? What do grasses do? Well, essentially, you know, you have this green vegetation on the top, right? But about 75% of the biomass of any grass plant, right, like many other plants, is below ground. And that tends to, and thatch is what we call it, but this is just dead and decaying organic matter. You know, not so much grass leaves, but when you see certain grasses that produce stolons and rhizomes, rooting material down in here, before it gets integrated with the soil down below and becomes a real loamy, live, healthy soil, it's just organic matter. And last time I checked, you know, one of the rules of a good thatch roof was it doesn't let water and things into it. So we want to be careful about how much organic matter we let it accumulate. But the nature of a perennial grassland cover will give you a very healthy supply of surface organic matter that over time, whether it's worms or other things that integrate these things, literally when you look at studies about organic matter over time, you see there's enough to support grass. This is a study conducted in the 1970s, right on the heels of the early contamination of the groundwater on Long Island that the potato farmers were implicated in many years ago. It's a single source aquifer. So a lot of study went into, hey, what about lawn fertilizers back in the 70s when this was becoming more popular? Well, scientists from Cornell went out all over Long Island and surveyed about 2,500 different lawns of various ages. And one of the things that they noticed was over time, as the lawn aged, the concentration of nitrogen in that soil was enough to support a healthy stand of grass. There was enough nitrogen stored in that organic matter that will release from microbial activity when the soils are warm to support a healthy turf grass stand. The other thing that's interesting is it plateaus. So if you keep adding nitrogen, it does two things. It goes off into the atmosphere and now is 300 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon. So we want to be very careful how we fertilize older stands, especially if they're not trafficked. Or if the plants can't use it, it leaks out, right? So aging stands present challenges in the way you manage them from an environmental perspective. They present challenges in the amount of carbon that they'll store. But if you can get them to sustain close cut vegetation, whatever that frequency is, for a period of time, they literally require very little inputs at all if they're done properly. And the place start with soils is to do everything you can to not disturb them, right? This is, again, a project conducted during on the heels of Superstorm Sandy when it came through. A ravine got washed out and had to get reestablished. And, now you're disturbing the soil. And of course, in the cemetery world, you're always dealing with it. Here's an example of what the Bermuda grass infestations look like. And these things become more acute every time we bury someone. We create opportunity for invasives to move in. So urban grasslands, while maybe not as acute as cemeteries, are all going to experience some kind of disturbance. And I can tell you, first and foremost, you should treat the soil as almost sacred if you believe in those sorts of things. That to disturb it is to release gases and change the flora. And if I do it, I want to be very careful. Don't just go dig a hole. Be very mindful of why you're digging it or why you're doing it, and protect soil like you would protect trees. Tree roots, right? You should look at minimizing disturbance in the way we look at minimizing the root zone of a tree. I feel that strongly, because if left alone, we don't need to do much. The more we fuss with it, the more we have to disturb it, the more difficult it becomes to get it back to what it was, number one, or number two, keep maintenance minimal. All right, let's talk about managing traffic. The variety of ways. If you think that parks aren't going to get more pressure after this COVID thing. Maybe I'm completely crazy, or maybe I've got confirmation bias because I'm a grass person. But when I talk to my colleagues who are managing these spaces, they're like, we got to close them. We got so many people. We don't know where to put them. We're wearing out the grass. I never had so much traffic on my lawns. And now I'm having to, distribute my workforce in 5 trucks instead of 1, or 15 carts instead of 7, because everybody's got to have their own thing until we completely adapt. So listen, as you get people into these grasslands, this is what's going to complicate our lives dramatically from a management perspective. Look at this. Is this, well, that looks like good social distancing. Looks like you got a little more than 6 feet there, at least for now, right? So these are the kinds of things we're going to have to brace ourselves for, maybe even more intensely. Is this what we're going to do, right? Everything at Central Park is permitted. You have to get a permit to go and use it for any active use, and dogs and things like that are restricted. Urban grasslands are characterized by getting people to use them. If they're historic, they're likely even more sensitive. I mean, we rebuilt the entire Central Park Great Lawn back in the mid-90s. It's 20 acres of sand-based. It's a sand-based putting green. It's a 20-acre sand-based athletic field that requires enormous amounts of maintenance and input. And the only reason they're able to do it is because they restrict traffic on it. That's a dramatic example of a shift they've made in the landscape. Still looks like a grassland, but now it's got grass on it all the time. This was a picture from a Texas park that was during the lockdown. What was happening? Are these wide enough paths? Is that 6 feet? What's going to happen when we have to start disturbing these things or changing the way we have to let people access them? This is a big issue, and I think one that most people don't give a second thought to, especially, in a cemetery or a historic place. But I promise you, if you live near people and people are looking for green space and that's all they got, they're coming. So part of that, let me take a break here again, Joe, see if there's any questions before I move into grasses.
No questions in the Q&A as of now.
Okay.
Well, there's just one now.
Okay.
Based on your experience with the large players in the turf industry, what are some of the main barriers they pose to the success of this project's mission?
Well, that's a pretty loaded question. Thank you very much, whoever decided to ask it.
Anonymous.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much for that. There's a lot of there's industries become established and then develop a set of practices that get translated, in the case of turf grass, from pastures and production ag back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then over time, as technology, mechanical, biological, and chemical came to the market, what was possible just got expanded like every other part of industrial society. And as we are thinking about the way we use resources and the things that we do, the industries that we've built to support those industry standards, much like, fossil fuel driven cars, are not going away anytime soon. They're not going away anytime soon. There's always going to be, I have to say, during this whole process, I've watched, a lot of the sales force in my industry, figure out what the new normal is going to look like if they can't visit their customers. And, they're looking for ways of constantly promoting the products that you wonder, in a new world, is it going to be what we want? I think that's all the way from the way we design mowers to the way we design chemicals to the way we approach mowing large landscapes. There's going to be resistance to change, even as dramatic as the change is we're just experiencing. But I do think the direction that we're taking Greenwood in particular as a model historic urban grassland, I think represents a more technological, data-driven approach, practice-based versus product-based and chemical technologies there. Now, not to say we won't use technologies, but what we're trying to do is piecemeal it in a strategic way so that we're using always as minimum of every non-renewable resource as we possibly can.
Got two more questions. You got time?
I do.
Okay. Robin Rick from the Woodlands Historic Cemetery in Philadelphia writes, any recommendations for specific procedures related to restoring lawn post-burial?
We've been, what a great question. And Joe knows this firsthand. We've been struggling with this mightily, because the answer to the question, as we're finding, thank you for this great question. The answer to the question that we're finding is that it is based on factors that in our case are prioritized as the following. Number one, burials are occurring at a very active rate in that area. If you have an area that there's a lot of disturbance that's going to happen, we have different practices there than we do to an older place that's not disturbed very often, if at all. The next criteria in our case is how much of the invasive plant is there. Because that gets the biggest advantage wherever we disturb. And so we're trying to figure out a way to address it there. And then we have microclimate, right? Is this area conducive to the grasses that we normally plant? Because we find in some cases, like the fine leaf fescues, for example, which are great low mow, slow growing grasses on south facing slopes where they dry out, we've found if there's any Bermuda grass anywhere nearby, they can be overtaken in a very short period of time. So I wish there was a single answer. One of the things that we want to study in our next phase that we hope continues to get funding moving forward is exactly this. What does this soil in the background, what are the characteristics of this soil? And what are the things we need to do to restore it to this as soon as possible? But fundamentally, the answer to your question is, it has nothing to do with biology and chemistry in many cases. It's simply restoring physical structure. That's the damage that gets done every time we dig. And so in many ways, in a perfect world, what I would do is to have a device that takes out the top 18 inches. This is a great question. To cut it right here. Let me get a pen, right? To cut it right here, right? Lift it out and set it aside. And then dig at will, and then when you're done, just drop this thing right back in there. Now, let me go back, and I know Joe's laughing at, I'm sure Joe's got a smile on his face while I'm doing this, but let me just remind you, this is life at Greenwood, right? And I'm sure this is life for you at the cemetery. This is the way we've dug graves. Everybody's trained in it. These particular people are some of the best technicians I see dig graves. They're very clean about their procedure, enormously clean about it. But the idea of saving that top part, we're going to approach that really, really carefully because it's a major change in the way you do it. So what we're doing in the short term, to return to this, is we're sod cutting. We're taking a sod cutter and we're just taking this part off and then seeing if we can restore it back on as we resurface. So we'll see how that goes. It also takes out the rhizomes of the Bermuda grass and prevents them from reestablishing. So I wish I had a short answer to your question about it, but the procedures are tricky and the soil targets for us are maybe different for everybody else.
Got one more question here. Should a historic property try to replicate the lawn style from the period of historic interest?
That's a great question. I mean, it's fascinating. It's not for me to say, but here's what I can tell you. I think you can, but I think you better be prepared for what that's going to look like. I think that's not going to look like the fine turf that we imagine. And in fact, if you start planting bent grasses, and Joe will tell you, we have bent grasses all over Greenwood. And everybody's like, well, how'd that get here? Well, it could get there by birds crapping on it over the last couple hundred years. But it was a part of a lot of lawn mixes, as we see, even though there's not strict records of these things in the Greenwood archives, we can be sure that these were being planted back then. And, those are grasses that do terrible when you let them grow high and try to mow them. They look beautiful when you stop mowing them completely, and they only grow to about 5 or 6 inches in flower. So for that purposes, again, I think the answer to that question lies in the change in aesthetic. And I think as we move forward here, let me do that. As we move forward here, what we're testing at Greenwood is things from glyphosate tolerant Kentucky bluegrass sod, which is now available for use in the United States in the commercial market, both seed and sod, all the way down to pasture and bentgrass mixes that would have been used in historic times. Here's a native plant mix, a Long Island native plant mix that we worked out locally with some local native plant people. As well as grasses that can take more traffic and will recover more quickly, as well as grasses that are traditional and low mow, low growing grasses. So I don't have a particular answer, but we're studying the entire gamut of it here. And I'd encourage you to do the same. I mean, we were afforded this wonderful opportunity with our partners at Greenwood to think through how we would approach this. And our first thinking was, okay, this is an area that's going to get regularly mowed. Right. So for now, we're going to regularly mow it. It's so busy. I mean, you can see all the scarring in here. See every one of these things. For those of you that aren't at cemeteries, this happens 15 to 20 times a day, a day at 300 days a year. So there's no way dealing with this is on the scale we've got to deal with it has become, I got a lot of good ideas, but I don't have any good idea that scales to 400 acres easily. That's the biggest challenge I'm facing. So, Joe, I'm going to keep moving and try to keep us close to 1 o'clock. There's been some of this work done by the National Park Service. A colleague of mine, Marty Petrovic, a number of years ago, worked with the Olmsted Center in doing some research, looking at some of these old grasses and looking at what Martin Van Buren would have had. And again, I didn't see anything that indicated any of these species were native. They were almost all related to the fact that this was a farm that they started to clip more frequently around his house. So again, looking for grasses, there's many ways to do it. But I would say the most important thing to do is look around. I don't care if it's all grass. Here's an example of Greenwood where it's a shaded area. It looks like you can tell it's getting some traffic. There's a combination of plant materials in there. Looks like some English ivy. But you see, wherever the path is, right? You don't see as much ivy in there. But as soon as it gets suppressed just a little bit, it looks like it's functioning really well. Now, I got to tell you, I don't know anything about these sorts of things because I've spent my entire 30-year career studying stuff you mow every week, or in my case, golf courses, stuff you mow every day, right? So I'm looking for research in these areas, and I don't find it where the two industries come together. And many of you may have a lot more access to really good information about these things and plant materials than I do. All right, so let's go to pollinator friendliness. Listen, when we stopped mowing, at Greenwood, this is what started to happen. And I can tell you to a person, almost invariably, everybody who visited the cemetery who didn't have a loved one or wasn't associated to a gravesite there absolutely loved our project of reducing mowing and trying to create some perpetual meadows in and amongst the Greenwood landscape. And what we learned are we have important pollinator and carbon storage roles, both in storing carbon deeper and providing a longer, more pollinator-friendly habitat. Now, in Greenwood, we're also drawing on some of my old golf course research, right, where you have these fescue, fine fescue monocultures in the areas outside of where most people hit their balls, but people still hit their balls in it. So they want to be able to find their golf balls. So we have to change the mowing height. So here you're looking at this gets mowed one time a year in November, right? And then it's allowed to grow the entire season. And this is mowed 3 times a year, right? Once in May, once in June, and once in November. And you can see that the height and flower and everything. And we don't want to, in our case, we don't want to obscure the stones. So obviously height and density is also a factor, and we can accomplish some of this, we think, with more strategic mowing. And since we're talking about mowing, I want to skip over that. It's hard to do strategic mowing sometimes on these historic landscapes. This is a historic fort in upstate New York, where mowing, you can see, happens in a very interesting way. Lots of obstacles, nowhere near what we have. We got some slopes that you can see are maybe mowed with a remote control device or a robot. But what we've done at Greenwood now is start to implement a equipment tracking system that we are adapting from the golf course industry, because we haven't found one that we felt to be reliable for the landscape and grounds industry. And what it's allowing us to do is to say, on this day, this particular island was mowed, right? But on the next day, you can see the equipment went to another island. We've been able to determine the intervals between mowing, and now we're matching this up with growth rate that we're modeling and measuring. And so we'll be able to deploy the mowing workforce. We were able to conclude that the average grass at Greenwood is cut, every 13 days, as little as 7, as many as 18. Right? So if you're trying to cut back and mow strategically, you want to be careful how many times you do it, or you're moving to an automated operation. Someday you'll have a data-driven approach, a data-driven way to deploy the mower so that you're not burning a single drop of fossil fuel more than you have to. That is the level of due diligence that we hold ourselves to in the Greenwood project. And that requires data behind these things. So everything you're seeing there are data points that we're creating and developing and interpreting so that an intelligent model can be built behind the way these grasslands are managed moving forward, be they for meadows, and we have a whole meadow management specification that we've developed, or for the traditional historic parts of the landscape that up to this point were pretty much mowed and trimmed every 7 days. So the variety of landscape, the diversity within a landscape, like a place like Greenwood, that are affording us now about 40 acres of perpetual meadow that we've completely changed the mowing down to 3 mows a year. So we saved about 10% of the land from regular mowing. And now we're obviously using this very interesting information for what the path forward looks like if massive production mowing isn't possible. Right? So just to remind you, thank you for taking the time to join us today. And Joe, I'm happy to take some questions and stick around. I'm about 5 minutes late for my lecture, and I told them that I would be as late as 1:15. So I can spend about another 10 minutes, and then I got to go.
Okay. 2 questions so far. We have one. Do the mowers that cut discharge out the mower deck chute, or do they use mulching kits to recycle the clips?
It's a great question. And one of the challenges we face is that we've had a difficult time with some of our cooperators finding equipment that will do what we want it to do. The mowers that we've used are that they've tried that aren't bush hogs, like walk behind bush hogs, or large blades that turn in a rotary fashion that can be set much higher. They're just sort of mulching mowers. They haven't used those. They haven't used ones that you can find for golf courses that have collection devices on them either. Although that I think would be the best choice, but will not fit easily between the stones. And so what I think they've gone to are they've got some 0-turn mowers that are able to go higher and mulch. They simply blow the clippings down or back or to the side as close as they can, but they have to go at a very slow ground speed. What we found is one of the toughest things early on last year when we were converting and mowing down meadows is they were just using traditional mowing equipment set at 3.5 inches, and having to go over the same ground 4 times to return it to fine turf. And so that's really led to rethinking it. And now we've already heard from our partners that they're going to try these flail mowers moving forward. So I do think I'm learning about this. I think the industry that traditionally manages manicured landscapes is learning about this. And that's exacerbated even more so in a place like a cemetery, where even things that would work, like I know there's a number of European devices that are narrow and will collect the material. I want to collect that material. Oddly enough, I know everyone thinks I'm crazy, but it does make it easier to manage. And to be honest, one of the problems that I'm having is that soil continues to get rich. and the richer it builds, right? And the more we leave stuff on it, while it is perfectly fine to do it, and as long as we can, you know, store it deeper, I'm happy. But there's a part of me every once in a while that wants to harvest it off, especially if I can harvest off weed seeds. If I want a non-chemical approach, taking some of the weed seeds off might be important as well. So I think it's a balance. We don't have really good answers to the equipment yet.
Can you briefly describe the little